Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our lecture on chapter 31. So this is the last chapter that we're going to cover where we talk about how the economy works in the long run. After today, we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about short-run fluctuations in the macroeconomic system and how government can potentially stabilize those short-run fluctuations. But this is the last section in the long run, last chapter in the long run section of the course. And we're going to talk about international trade. So far, some of the things we've done have kind of just ignored the international sector. Obviously, that's ridiculous. Obviously, the real world is very interconnected globally, and the international component is a major part of a macroeconomic system. But incorporating international trade and finance just makes it more complicated. And all the points that we expressed earlier can be made more simply just by ignoring the foreign sector. But now we're going to come back and we're going to incorporate the basics of what we're talking about when we're talking about international trade and international finance. The following chapter, chapter 32, is actually a really good chapter that helps you understand how financial capital moves across international borders, and it helps you understand how exchange rates move. But we're not going to have time to cover that chapter, but if you are interested, I encourage you to read that chapter on your own. If this were a full macro class where we didn't have the micro section, I would spend time on that, but we just don't have the bandwidth. So let's get right to it. I'll share my PowerPoint presentation, chapter 31. Before, some of our models have been designed in the context of a closed economy. Just for simplicity, not for realism, but just for simplicity, we assumed that the economy was closed to international trade. But now we're switching gears, coming to a more realistic model, and we're going to consider an open economy, an economy that's open to international trade. Some real basic terms here. These terms are trivial. They're so simple, but just to review them just to make sure that everybody knows what we're talking about here. If your exports are greater than your imports, you have a trade surplus. If the reverse is true, you have a trade deficit. And of course, in kind of the rare case where the two are exactly equal, you have balanced trade. Pretty straightforward concepts there. If you look at the U.S., this chart goes back many decades, looking at how much we import and looking at how much we export. And you see that from 1960 up until 1980, the U.S. kind of had balanced trade. Imports and exports were pretty close. But starting in the early 80s, we started getting a trade deficit. We see that imports were much higher than exports, for the most part, pretty consistently, ever since 1980 up to the present. There's some years there where the trade deficit is larger, some years where the trade deficit is smaller, but overall, it's safe to say the U.S. is a trade deficit country. We import more stuff, we buy more stuff from other countries than we sell to other countries. We're not going to have a whole lot of time to go into why this is in this class because of the abbreviated nature of this course and because of the fact that it combines micro and macro. But if you have more time to read on your own, and even in the next chapter, you can get more information on kind of why this is the case. But at the very least, it's an interesting observation that we are a trade deficit nation. Now, here's an important concept: net capital outflow. This might be I don't know. You don't talk about this in the media. You may have never heard this term before, but you see the definition there. The purchase of foreign assets by domestic residents minus the purchase of domestic assets by foreign residents. So we're talking about purchase of financial assets here. Okay, we're not talking about purchase of goods and services. We're talking about purchase of financial assets, bonds and stocks that we buy from other countries, and bonds and stocks that other countries buy from us. So how many foreign financial assets are we buying, in America, just use that as the example, how many foreign financial assets are we buying minus how many of our financial assets are foreigners buying? That's termed net capital outflow. If net capital outflow is positive, we're buying more foreign financial assets and we're kind of accumulating foreign financial assets in this country. If net capital outflow is negative, then obviously the reverse is true. Foreigners tend to be accumulating more of our financial assets. If net capital outflow is positive, overall financial capital is flowing out of the country. That's the term outflow. You could, if you want to, you could also term negative net capital outflow as net capital inflow, but whatever, that term doesn't matter a whole lot. But here's a fundamental relationship that holds true in the economy in the long run. Net capital outflow equals net exports. Now here we're mixing and matching two different things. Net capital outflow refers to the flow of financial capital across international borders. But net exports, now we're switching gears back to trade. Net exports refers to goods and services that are bought and sold across international borders. So we're mixing financial markets with markets for goods and services here. But net capital outflow must equal net exports in an economy in a fundamental sense in the long run. I'm not going to go through. In the next chapter, again, if you have time to read ahead and to read the next chapter on your own, you can understand more about how this happens and the mechanism in place in the economy that makes this hold true. But for now, I'm just going to tell you kind of an intuitive story to help you understand how this equality holds true. So suppose we have a trade deficit, okay? Suppose we have a trade deficit. That means that we bought more stuff from foreign countries than they sold to us. So if we have a trade deficit, then US dollars are left overseas, right? If we buy more stuff from them than they buy from us, then the result is, at the end of the day, US dollars kind of remain out there floating around overseas. Now, those US dollars aren't going to just be put under mattresses. I mean, people aren't going to just sit on those US dollars. They're going to use those US dollars to buy dollar-denominated stocks and bonds. That's how this works in a basic sense. The trade deficit means that US dollars are left floating around overseas. Those dollars will ultimately be used to purchase US financial assets, and that will correspond to a negative net capital outflow, right? They're buying more of our financial assets than we're buying of their financial assets. It'll be a negative net capital outflow corresponding to the negative net exports, corresponding to the trade deficit. That's a real simple explanation, but that gives you the basic idea of what we're talking about here when we say that net capital outflow must equal to net exports. Now here's another little tidbit. We've talked about this equation before, way back in the GDP chapter, Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports plus NX. That's an equation that should be comfortable to you now. You can also rearrange it, and you can introduce a new term. Y minus C minus G is defined as national savings. Y minus C minus G is defined as national savings. That makes sense. Y represents all of our income, and C represents all of our income that we spend on consumer goods, that make us happy today. And G represents all the money that we spend on public goods and services. And, what we have left over is our savings. We call that national savings. And so, just follow that equation. Savings must equal investment. That, we talked about that before. But now to make this model richer, savings must equal investment plus net exports. And then we know the net exports must equal net capital outflow. So follow the equation to the last stage over here. Savings must equal investment. Savings must equal investment plus net capital outflow. And now this is how you should think about this. Savings represents the money that we put into the system, the savings that we put into the system. We talked about savings behavior a couple of chapters ago. You know what that means. It goes into the system and it can be used as it kind of comes out of the financial system. It can be used to finance domestic investment, or it can go overseas to buy foreign financial assets. Does that make sense? We put money into the system. We put savings into our financial system. Financial system works. That money can be used to finance domestic investment, which is what we've been talking about for a long time now, or it can be used to finance the purchase of financial assets overseas. Should be intuitive. It's richer, and this is a richer and more realistic model than what we said back a couple chapters ago when we were just ignoring international finance. Now, here's another term, the nominal exchange rate. The nominal exchange rate is just very simply the rate at which a person can trade the currency of one country for the currency of another country. For example, one US dollar may buy around 10 Mexican pesos. In that case, you could say the peso to dollar exchange rate is 10 to 1. Or you could say the dollar to peso exchange rate is 1 to 10. Right? Exchange rates can be expressed either way. They can be expressed pesos relative to dollars, or they can be expressed dollars relative to pesos. You can see them expressed either way. And like if you look in good newspapers, like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, they'll actually have it structured to where the exchange rates are expressed both ways. I mean, in those papers, they're showing the dollar exchange rate relative to a foreign currency, since they're American papers, obviously. So they'll show the dollar relative to the foreign currency exchange rate and the reverse in two different columns. If you look like kind of in small newspapers, you'll only see it expressed one way, but good newspapers express it both ways. You can express it either way. It's not a big deal. You just have to make sure that you are kind of consistent. If you're talking about different exchange rates, and if you're ever doing any math with exchange rates, you have to make sure that you don't accidentally flip it around. You have to make sure you're consistent with your approach. But we're not going to go through any kind of numerical examples in this class that require you to do that. Usually exchange rates in America are discussed in terms of the foreign currency relative to the dollar. So it'll usually be the peso to the dollar exchange rate, or the yen to dollar exchange rate, or the Canadian dollar relative to the US dollar exchange rate. We do that kind of as a convention because the US dollar is nominally more expensive than most other currencies. So the foreign currency expressed relative to the dollar will be a whole number, since the denominator is going to be smaller in that case. If you flip it around, you're mostly going to be dealing with decimals, since the US dollar is nominally more expensive than most currencies. It's not true for all currencies, but it's true for most. I'll just encourage you actually just to look around on the Wall Street Journal website, just to kind of go into the financial section and just browse through what some of the different exchange rates are. I don't know, I'm nerdy. I think that's just kind of interesting to do for some reason. So suppose that, let's just consider the peso to dollar exchange rate, 10 to 1, something like that. If that ratio gets higher, right, if $1 will buy more pesos, then that means the dollar is appreciating or the dollar is strengthening. If the dollar will buy more pesos, the dollar is appreciating or strengthening. If the reverse is true, if the dollar will buy fewer pesos, then the dollar is depreciating or weakening. That's just the terminology that you use. Currency is appreciating, currency is depreciating, currency is strengthening, a currency is weakening. But you know already, right? I hope you know already. I hope you know where we're going. We don't really care that much about nominal exchange rates. We don't really care that much about any nominal variable, right? We talk about nominal variables because they're kind of the basis for which we kind of build our understanding of the economy. But in the big picture, we don't care about nominal variables. We care about real variables. So here what we care about is, of course, the real exchange rate, the rate at which the goods of one country will trade for the goods of another country. You know, you see in my notes, in the book example, 1/2 bushel of Japanese rice may trade for one bushel of American rice, right? That would be a real exchange rate. If 1 bushel of American rice trades for 1/2 of a bushel of Japanese rice, that's a real exchange rate. Refers to how the goods of a country trade for the goods of another country. And the thing is this, I mean, for the nominal exchange rate to be higher, that doesn't mean anything. The US dollar is kind of more valuable than most other currencies, like I say, but that doesn't really mean a whole lot. I mean, for example, the British pound is actually the reverse. It's actually more valuable than the US dollar. But that doesn't mean that Britain is richer than the US. I mean, the fact that that ignores is it ignores how many dollars there are and how many pounds there are. Just to say that $1 is worth less than 1 pound, so what? Who cares? That doesn't consider kind of how many dollars there are in the world. I mean, that's just a very, very, very naive example. So nominal exchange rates don't mean much, as is true with any nominal variable. And if your currency is more valuable than the currency of another country, that does not mean that your country is richer or better off in any way. Anyway, the real exchange rate is what we care about. Here's, of course, our expression for the real exchange rate. This expression, if you just look at it, it seems weird, I think. But here's what you do. You take the domestic price of your good and you multiply it by the nominal exchange rate. Now, you have to make sure when you're doing this, you have to make sure that you have your nominal exchange rate expressed correctly in terms of whether it's this way or whether it's flipped. But we're not going to get into that detail. That's not important here. But you take your domestic price and multiply it by the nominal exchange rate. And what will that do, right? This parenthetical term that will convert the domestic price into the foreign currency, right? If you multiply something by the nominal exchange rate, that will convert the domestic price into the foreign currency. So then, now that you have the converted domestic price, right, that's what the numerator here is, the parenthetical term. Once you have the converted domestic price, you express it relative to the foreign price. And that's your exchange rate. That's your exchange rate. Now, here's a question for you. And I asked this question, I've asked this question before when I've been teaching in-person classes, and people freak out. People look at me like I'm crazy. People look at me like, what? What is this question? What do you mean? What should the value of the real exchange rate be? I'm actually asking for a real number here. I'm not asking for like a conceptual thing. I'm not asking for alpha or beta or gamma, or I'm not asking for high or low. I'm asking for a real number. Think here, the real exchange rate. We take the domestic price, we convert it to the foreign currency. We express that converted price relative to the foreign price. What should that ratio be? Give me an actual number. I want you to pause your video. I want you to not read the book. I don't want you to look this up online. I want you to just think about it. Just think outside the box. And when I was a kid, I used to do dumb things all the time. I used to do dumb things constantly, and I still do. But whenever I would do something dumb, my dad would say, think, son, just think. Think about what you're doing. Don't just act it randomly. Think about what you're doing. Well, I'm getting sidetracked here. That's what I'm telling you. Just think about this. Okay, pause your video. Now that you figured it out. Oh my God, you figured it out. I'm so proud of you. The real exchange rate should be 1. The real exchange rate should be 1, right? The nominal exchange rate times the domestic price, right? The converted domestic price should be equal to the foreign price. Therefore, that ratio should be 1. The real exchange rate should be 1. This leads us to this fundamental principle that we have called purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity, the law of one price. It's the same thing. Purchasing power parity is just referred to as the law of one price. That's the same thing. Just think about it. If that's not true, then arbitrage will occur. Arbitrage will occur if the law of one price doesn't hold. Right? Think about American wheat versus French wheat. If American wheat is more expensive than French wheat, what are people going to do? Entrepreneurs will see that. They'll see a profit opportunity and they'll go to France and buy cheap wheat and bring it to America and sell it for a higher price. And as that happens, that'll drive up demand. That'll drive up the price in France. It'll drive up supply. It'll drive down the price in the US, and that will happen until the prices become the same. That will restore the law of one price. So if the theory of purchasing power parity doesn't hold, that will mean that there's a profit opportunity. for people to buy in the cheap area, sell in the more expensive area. As that happens, that activity, those arbiters will be making money, right? Those arbiters will obviously be making profits on this whole transaction, and that will drive the prices to parity. That will ensure that the real exchange rate equals 1. Now, I will say there are some limits to the theory of purchasing power parity. First is just simply transportation cost. I mean, in the example I just gave, it would cost money to take French wheat and to bring it to America and sell it. So there is some limit there, right? I mean, the exchange rate won't be exactly 1, because if the exchange rate's really, really, really close, you wouldn't be justified, right? If you're an entrepreneur or if you're an arbiter, you wouldn't be justified in transporting the wheat across the ocean if the price difference is just very small. So the price difference has to be big enough to justify that transaction cost. Does that make sense? So it's not going to be exactly 1, but it's going to be close to 1, given the limits of, given the limits placed on us by transactions costs. But that's not important. I don't think that is something that should deter you here, because that's a minor issue. But furthermore, there are other barriers. There are other limits on arbitrage. For one thing, there can be barriers to trade, right? Maybe you can't just simply buy French wheat and come and sell it in America. There may be trade restrictions. There could be tariffs in place, or there could be other export restraints or import restraints in place that could prevent that arbitrage from happening. So that's their baseline, right? This purchasing power parity is a baseline, but it can be affected by trade policy, and it can also be affected by other factors. For example, if a country is experiencing a lot of unrest, if a country is in civil war, if some horrible dictator has just taken over a country, like you see in a lot of revolutions that have happened over the last 100 years or whatever, or not 100 years, over the entire course of human history. But if there's unrest, if there's civil war, if there's violence in a country, people may not seize that arbitrage opportunity because they're worried about getting involved in that violence in some way. So that's another example of a limit on arbitrage. And there can be other limits as well. I mean, for example, there might just be a higher demand for tourism in Paris versus tourism in Clarksburg, West Virginia. And, if we have a restaurant meal in Clarksburg versus a restaurant meal in Paris, you can't arbitrage those because they're really totally different goods. And they don't lead to arbitrage opportunities. That's kind of a ridiculous example, but I'm just saying not everything can be traded, and there are other limits. But the theory of purchasing power parity is our baseline. It's really our starting point. Now, the one thing to mention is this here, implications for inflation. Implications for inflation. I'm going to stop screen share because that's the end of the presentation. So the theory of purchasing power parity is our baseline. What does that mean? Suppose that we're talking about suppose we're talking about the, trade and international finance between the U.S. and Japan, between the dollar and the yen. Suppose the U.S. had, just to make it simple, just to make the number simple, suppose the U.S. has no inflation. Oh, actually, I have some simple examples in my scribble in my notes. And I should just use the numerical example that's in my notes rather than just make this up off the top of my head. Okay, look at the example in my notes. Suppose that originally the yen to dollar ratio is 4. You can take $1 and buy 4 yen with it. It's actually much higher than that. You can buy over 100 yen with $1, but let's just say it's 1 to 4. So suppose we start out and the nominal exchange rate between the dollar and the yen is 4 to 1. 4 yen to $1. And suppose that the US, just for simplicity, suppose we have no inflation, and suppose that Japan has 25% inflation. 25% inflation is really high inflation. I'm just going to use that to make the numbers easy. Well, you have a handful of US dollar bills. The law of one price says that handful of dollar bills should be able to buy the same good for the same price anywhere in the world. That's what the law of one price says, right? This handful of dollar bills, no matter what, it should be able to buy a bushel of wheat for the same price anywhere in the world. Using that logic, following up on this, if we start out with a 4-to-1 yen to dollar exchange rate, if the US has no inflation, if Japan has 25% inflation, handful of dollar bills should still be able to buy the same amount of stuff in Japan, even after prices have inflated in Japan by 25%. Follow the logic. The exchange rate will move in this scenario from 4-to-1 to 5-to-1 to make sure that that law of one price holds, is maintained. Even though this is really simple, and even though it doesn't take a whole lot to kind of get to this point, I mean, we've only been talking for just a few minutes, this theory of purchasing power parity, it can explain a lot of what you see. When you look at exchange rate movements, I'm talking about when you look at nominal exchange rate movements, just relative rates of inflation, right? This country has high inflation, that country has low inflation. The dollar, the currency of the low inflation country is appreciating, the currency of the high inflation country is weakening. That logic can explain a lot of what you see with exchange rate movements. It's a very powerful tool to understand so much of what you see in international finance, even though it's so simple. Anyway, this chapter just sets up the basics of international trade and finance. It's a real simple chapter. That's it. That's the whole chapter. We're done. We don't have time to cover the next chapter, but I would strongly encourage you to just read the next chapter on your own, because it's got really interesting stuff. And I'll see you next time. We'll be back to talk about the economy in the short run, fluctuations in GDP over the short run, the business cycle, and what the government can or should do in response to those fluctuations. The next part of the chapter will be, next part of the course will be really interesting as well. Talk to you soon.